Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here participating in this symposium. And I think the previous speaker really provided a lead into this whole topic, because we just talked about the importance of dopamine D2 receptor antagonism to achieve antipsychotic efficacy. But I'm going to tell you that 5-HT1A receptors are a very interesting target to bring something extra that you can't get with dopamine blockade by itself. But before we get into the detail of that, I'd just like to show you this slide, which is really a list of reviews which have appeared over recent years, where essentially there seems to be a changing concept in the kind of antipsychotics that people are liking to go for. And these are the terms which we find. Designed multiple ligands, selectively non-selective drugs, or multi-target drugs, and such like. So basically the idea here is that for a multifactorial pathology such as schizophrenia or other psychiatric disorders, perhaps just hitting one target, one receptor, maybe just can't do everything we would like it to do. And therefore, it's interesting to have several different activities combined into one molecule in order to improve the therapeutic profile of the drugs that we select. And the serotonin family of receptors is a very good choice to hunt for new targets because of at least two things. One is the number of receptors that are in this family. There's at least 12 or 15 according to how you count them and whether you go for the splice variants and the different isoforms. And also by virtue of the different mechanisms which they include. Now this is a dendrogram of sequence homology. This was taken from the UFAR classification of serotonin receptors, which was published in 1994. It doesn't yet show 5-HT3 and 5-HT4 receptors because they weren't yet sequenced at that time, but it does show the two major families of serotonin receptors which are still today the ones which are being talked about the most, the 5-HT2 receptors, and of course 5-HT2A receptor antagonism has been for the past couple of decades the serotonergic target for antipsychotic atypical drugs, but also the 5-HT1 family, and without going into all the details of the different subtypes, the 5-HT1A is particularly interesting because it's located both as an autoreceptor controlling serotonin release, but also it's located in postsynaptic regions in different brain structures. And so that's really what I'd like to focus on today. There's been a lot of increasing interest in this target, and various reviews have appeared in the literature over the years. I think the first one, which appeared in 1999, and it was Herb Meltzer that published this review. I think he was the first that suggested that there would be a new generation of antipsychotics which would combine D2 antagonism with 5-HT1A agonism. So I think he was the first that actually proposed that idea, and that's been developed and explored even further by other people. And if you enter the search terms 5-HT1A and antipsychotic, or 5-HT1A and cognition in PubMed, there's really been an explosion in the number of publications and interest in this field. I think it reflects just how much this has been growing and attracting attention. So let's have a little quick overview of the historical background of this field. I think the story really begins in the early 90s, or late 80s even, when 5-HT1A agonists were shown to be anti-cataleptic. So of course catalepsy is a model of an animal model of extrapyramidal symptoms, and 5-HT1A agonists are capable of eliminating that catalepsy. So that obviously attracted attention at that time. And then we showed back in 1996 that clozapine is a 5-HT1A partial agonist in vitro, and they were shown in cloned cellular systems, but it also had apparently in vivo functional correlates, because the anxiolytic effect of clozapine in a rat model of ultrasonic vocalization was shown to be mediated by 5-HT1A receptors. And a whole series of neurochemical studies showed that the effect of clozapine on medial prefrontal cortex dopamine release was partially 5-HT1A receptor mediated. Herb Meltzer's group showed that even antipsychotics, atypicals such as risperidone or olanzapine, which do not directly interact with 5-HT1A receptors, nevertheless require 5-HT1A receptors to mediate some of their dopamine release properties. And recently, just a few months ago, Francesc Artigas's laboratory in Barcelona used a receptor knockdown technique to show that 5-HT1A receptors are required in order to have the dopamine release effects of atypical antipsychotics. And there's been a whole series of receptor regulation studies showing that the 5-HT1A receptor is regulated. Most of these studies show an upregulation in schizophrenic brain, so supporting the idea of a neurophysiological relevance of this receptor in the pathology. And then really some landmark studies by Tomiki Sumiyoshi and colleagues in the early part of this decade, where a 5-HT1A partial agonist, so this was tendosterone, was co-administered with neuroleptics in schizophrenic patients, and that produced an improvement in their cognitive state. So that was a small clinical trial. It's been confirmed since in other studies, showing that this has real clinical support. And then subsequently, there's also been a whole discussion on the this 5-HT1A polymorphism. It's the C1019G polymorphism in the promoter region of the receptor, which influences the presynaptic and also the postsynaptic expression of the receptor, and it has the influence of impeding negative symptom response to antipsychotics. So, of course, all of this provides electrophysiological, it provides neurochemical, molecular, and clinical support to say that 5-HT1A receptors are important in antipsychotic response. And this has led, of course, to a lot of discussion around drugs which have 5-HT1A properties. The one that has been most discussed, of course, is aripiprazole, but there's also perosporone, which are both marketed. But there's been other drugs which have been thoroughly explored at a pharmacological level, including the SSR compound F15063 and adoprazine, which is a compound from Solvay. And then, of course, there's compounds which have been taken through to the advanced stages of development. Bifepranox was submitted to the FDA but was refused as non-approvable. This is, we think, essentially because it had too much partial agonism at D2 receptors. It's a partial agonist, but it's more partial agonist than aripiprazole. We think that that interferes with a therapeutic response. As we heard just now, you have to have a blockade of D2, and this didn't seem to do so enough. But these other drugs are going through their development stages. A drug from Pfizer. This is from Gideon Richter and the co-developed with Forest, and the lorazepam is from Dainippon Sumitomo. So what do these drugs look like in terms of their affinity profiles? And this is binding data. So this is a PKI. This is a measure of affinity at a whole series of different receptors: D2, 5-HT1A, 5-HT2A, 2C, alpha-1, alpha-2, M1, and H1. And haloperidol, of course, has high affinity at D2 receptors, whereas the atypicals, such as clozapine, have this, let's say, a signature, which is a high affinity at 5-HT2 and lower affinity at D2 receptors. And this is really the standard recipe for atypical antipsychotics over the past years. Of course, you notice as well that clozapine also interacts with a whole series of other receptors, including the histamine H1, muscarinic M1, and 5-HT2C receptors. Of course, these interactions may be considered to be undesirable because they have been associated with a variety of
side effects which maybe we would rather avoid. So if you look at the compounds, the more recent compounds, which have greater interaction with FOHT1A receptors, well, you can see straight away that they have a much more Spartan receptor profile. We really lost a lot of affinity at a whole series of other receptors. So virtually no affinity at H1 or M1, for example, and even the FOHT2A to C affinities are gone, and we're really much more focused on D2 and FOHT1A. Now, what I haven't shown here is affinity at D3, for example, or D4. All of these compounds interact at some level with those additional receptors. But I think the message is clear. What we have is drugs which are much more selectively promiscuous, much more targeted to associating a couple of activities, notably D2 and FOHT1A. Now, these compounds are not just binding, but they're activating FOHT1A receptors, and this is something that can be measured in a whole series of different in vitro tests, such as G protein activation, or adenyl cyclase inhibition, or ERK phosphorylation, and receptor internalization studies. And we carried out a whole series of comparisons of these drugs. So on the left here you have clozapine and ziprasidone, and then you have the more recent exploratory compounds, but also aripiprazole, bifepinox, doprazine, 15063, and the SSR compound. And basically the message is that they're all partial agonists with different amounts of efficacy. Now here, as a reference, there's buspirone, to give you an idea of the level of efficacy in each system. And basically the agonist efficacy at FOHT1A depends on the drug. You can see that some drugs are more efficacious than others, but also on the signal transduction response. And you can see that here they all get to about 40%, whereas here it's more variable, and here we're getting up to like 70 or 80%. So there's a message there. Be careful when somebody tells you, oh, what's the efficacy at FOHT1A? Is it 30% or 60%? You have to ask the question, what's your reference drug and what's the signal transduction system? Make sure you have internal references that you can compare with. But basically the message is that these are partial agonists of different efficacies. And the exact efficacy at FOHT1A is important because, for one thing, as I mentioned earlier on, FOHT1A agonism opposes catalepsy. And this is an experiment where the catalepsy was measured in two tests, the cross-leg position and the bar test. So these are positions in which a rat is placed, which is totally unnatural to its normal behavior. But a rat will maintain these positions if it's given a drug such as haloperidol, which induces catalepsy. And that catalepsy can be reversed and completely abolished if you co-administer an efficacious agonist, such as this compound F13714. Whereas if you give a partial agonist, such as buspirone, you can see that there's a partial reversal in one of the tests and very little effect in the other one. And then, of course, if you give the antagonist, WAY-100-635, there's nothing happens at all. So the amount of efficacy that you have at FOHT1A receptors is important in order to achieve this anti-cataleptic property. And, of course, if you do have sufficient FOHT1A efficacy, then you're going to improve your separation of response, or your dose separation between an antipsychotic-like effect. This is apomorphine-induced climbing behavior in mice. So this is a model of hyperdopaminergic state. And you can see haloperidol has dose responses which are virtually superimposed. Whereas if you go to look at the drugs which have greater FOHT1A agonism, then you have a nice separation between the antipsychotic-like effect and the catalepsy induction. In fact, some of these drugs just don't produce catalepsy at all. So that gives an argument to include FOHT1A agonism in your choice of antipsychotic. But the amount really remains to be defined. If you look at a neurochemical readout, so this is a measure of medial prefrontal cortex dopamine release measured by microdialysis. Well, you can see that aripiprazole and bifepinox really don't have much stimulatory effect on dopamine release in this brain region. Now, I know there's some laboratories that managed to show a little bit of an influence by aripiprazole. I think Herb Meltzer managed to show it in a very narrow dose range, but these are clearly not robust effects. Whereas the more recent drugs do produce a substantial dopamine release. That's because you have the serotonin 5-HT1A property that predominates, whereas here it seems to be the D2 partial agonist properties that predominate. And if you look at a social interaction test, where you administer PCP, you get a decrease in the number of social interactions. You can quantify those. And if you ask the question, what drugs are able to reduce that PCP-induced deficit? Well, the answer is very simple. Basically, there's these three drugs that can do that, and particularly aripiprazole. And that's interesting because it's an intermediate level of 5-HT1 agonism that does this. Not all the drugs do it, only some of the drugs do it. So it suggests that there's a certain level of 5-HT1 agonism which is optimal. And this is confirmed. This is a complicated slide, but I'll just take it very quickly just to say that the effect of aripiprazole and the other two drugs is blocked by a 5-HT1A antagonist. So the attenuation of PCP-induced social interaction deficits requires that 5-HT1A receptor activation. And that's been confirmed by other studies in other laboratories. And what about a cognitive test? Well, we adopted a whole board test. So this is where we used an arena with 16 holes, 4 of which were baited with a food reward. And we can define a whole series of cognition-related measures. And aripiprazole, if we look at the score of working memory, basically brought back up the score on the working memory scale. So this is the PCP treated animals, but if you add aripiprazole, basically brings it back up. But you notice that the drug itself produced a bit of a deficit. These are the vehicle controls, and you see aripiprazole itself induced a slight deficit. And therefore you can build a summary table where we test lots of drugs and all these parameters, and aripiprazole scores against the PCP treated animals, but also has some deficits of its own. But basically what I'd like to attract your attention to is the fact that the more recent drugs seem to have a favorable profile at opposing the PCP-induced deficits without deleterious effects. And similar data has been reported by other authors using aripiprazole or perosporone. And these authors, have shown that the beneficial effects in these cognitive tests are blocked by a 5-HT1A antagonist. So once again, the message is you require 5-HT1A agonism for these drugs in order to achieve the effects on models of negative symptoms or cognitive dysfunction. Okay, just to say that not everything necessarily goes the way you would like it with 5-HT1A agonism. This is data from pre-pulse inhibition studies of startle response in rat. Well, the inhibition or pre-pulse inhibition by apomorphine is a classic test which is used to identify potential antipsychotics. So you can induce a deficit here, you can see that, and you can block that with drugs such as haloperidol. The problem is that 5-HT1A agonists also produce a deficit. So what happens when you put the two together, when you have drugs which express both of those properties? Well, once again, here we have haloperidol, and of course that reduces the deficit, it brings it back up again. But over on the other side, here, drugs which have more 5-HT1A activation, well, they fail to reverse the deficit because, of course, the 5-HT1A property itself is producing a deficit of its own. So perhaps what we're really looking for is something in the middle here, which has 5-HT1A activation, but not too much. So it goes back to this idea of having a cocktail where you want to dose the amounts of the different properties that you think are interesting. You take a bit of this, a bit of that, and you get it just right. And that's been called a balancing act by some reviewers. And I think this is just a summary slide. I'd just like to tie it all together on this slide. And basically, we have two parameters that really we're trying to balance according to this concept. One is D2 efficacy, and then the other one is 5-HT1A efficacy. And of course, if you're D2 antagonist, well, then you expect to be antipsychotic. But we have a certain number of elements which we'd rather avoid. And if you're an agonist, if you move up the scale of efficacy, well, of course, you avoid the extrapyramidal symptoms, but then, of course, you risk sacrificing the antipsychotic activity. And on the PhD1A side, the antagonist may bring some mood benefit, maybe as anxiolytics, but of course you lose the EPS reduction. Whereas the agonists, you'd expect to be antidepressant, you'd expect them to oppose EPS, but maybe have some other shortcomings of their own. And if you were to place drugs on this scale, then you'd expect haloperidol to be here. Clozapine is also an antagonist. Aripiprazole is intermediate because it's a partial agonist. But bifeprinox probably has crossed the line. It's gone too far. And it's sacrificed some of its antipsychotic efficacy because it has too much D2 agonism. And on the PhD1A side, as we've seen, these are all partial agonists at different degrees. So really the message is that we have a whole series of drugs coming through the drug development pipeline, which is going to be, I think, helpful and enable us to assess more carefully whereabouts this optimal balance is that we would like to identify. All these drugs which are combining D2 and 5-HT1A properties will help us to answer that question. Okay, very, very rapidly, and this is my last slide. I'd just like to say that we've been talking about 5-HT1A receptors and 5-HT1A receptor efficacy. I think there's a whole story that's coming through at the moment, which concerns subpopulations of 5-HT1A receptors. I think it's very exciting. So the question is, which subpopulations should we be targeting? And there's various reasons to think that it's post-synaptic 5-HT1A receptors which are interesting in improving antipsychotic profiles. And there's a whole series of reasons on that, but essentially, the message is that it's becoming possible to preferentially target at a pharmacological level those postsynaptic and particularly cortical 5-HT1A receptors. There's a drug which we've just reported recently, it's F15599, and I'd just like to highlight this data on the right-hand side here. This is a selective 5-HT1A agonist, very high efficacy in vitro, but if you look at the effects on dorsal raphe nucleus, this is electrical activity, these experiments performed in Francesca Artigas's lab in Barcelona. You can see that you have to go to very high doses in order to inhibit the firing rate of those neurons. Whereas at very low doses, we're already stimulating the electrical activity in the parabiral neurons in the frontal cortex. So we have an increase in the frontal cortex electrical activity of these pyramidal neurons at doses which do not dampen the general serotonergic tone. Okay, and this translates to superior profile in cognition tests compared with 8-hydroxydepet, which is the archetypal 5-HT1A agonist. It also has reduced serotonin behavioral syndrome and also antidepressant-like effects at very low doses. All this data has been published. So I think we're moving towards a situation where when we're selecting D2 and 5-HT1A compounds in future, we're going to have to ask ourselves the question, which subpopulations are we targeting? And in particular, are we affecting those postsynaptic cortical 5-HT1A receptors, which we think are most interesting? I'm going to stop there. I'd like to acknowledge all many people who contributed to this work, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.